The global economy is expected to contract by 3% in 2020, which would make the coronavirus crisis the worst recession since the Great Depression in the 1930s. So, what are their main takeaways? Is there any light at the end of the tunnel? I spoke with the IMF's chief economist to learn more. The IMF's economic forecasts are a regular event in financial journalists' calendars. Normally, I would be in Washington, D.C. with other journalists for a big press conference. But like so many other aspects of our lives, this year's spring meetings have moved online, which is why Chief Economist Geeta Gopinath and I connected via video conference to discuss the organization's latest predictions. I know this is a very busy week for you.
A lot going on, yes.
Economists' expectations for the economy have plummeted since the start of the year. In January, just weeks after the first report of a new coronavirus, the IMF predicted the economy would grow by 3.3% in 2020. Just 3 months later, that has been revised down to -3%. An adjustment of this scale in such a short period is exceptionally rare.
It's a truly global crisis, and the speed and the scale of it is really quite unparalleled.
In an effort to contain the deadly virus, governments around the world have called on their citizens to stay home and effectively shut down the economy. The Great Lockdown, as Geeta and her team have called it, is a crisis like no other. Why? Well, it is first and foremost a health emergency. Policymakers can't stimulate the economy in ways they normally would. Encouraging people to go out and spend their money isn't what you want when you need them to stay home. Uncertainty is also a factor. Just like a war, there is no clear end date for the pandemic and the subsequent economic shock we're experiencing. So you can see why this is a different crisis to the one seen in 2008.
In the past, when it would be a collapse in housing crises or bursting of a financial bubble, it would be quick and then it would go away and then economic policy would start fixing the problem. But this time around, it's a pandemic, and a lot is going to depend on what happens in public health, what happens with vaccines and therapeutics.
According to IMF figures, globally, about $8 trillion have been made available to support economies.
You have to keep in mind that of this 8 trillion, about 7 trillion is G20 economies. And a lot of the spending is happening in the richer parts of the world, while the poorer nations and the low income and the developing countries are having to battle this with much smaller resources.
Even within developed economies, the pandemic is putting massive pressure on labor markets. The IMF estimates the unemployment rates will reach 10.4% in both the United States and the Eurozone this year. What are the risks that we will actually see inequality becoming even a bigger problem in the aftermath of this crisis?
This is a crisis that's absolutely impacting poorer workers, daily wage workers, those who are involved in the restaurant sector, in tourism. You need countries to provide support to them, to get cash transfers to them. They have to use whatever social protection systems exist, scale them up, expand them, make them more unconditional. When you have a deep recession of this kind, there is always, unfortunately, a tremendous loss of income for people at the lower end of the income scale. So poverty can go up, inequality can go up.
A lot of countries remain in lockdown mode, and some fear a peak in contagion in the second half of the year. But provided countries are able to contain the virus and stabilize their economies by the end of the year, the fund is forecasting a partial recovery in 2021. Staring down an economic crisis that could contend with the Great Depression is daunting, to say the least. But Geeta says we do have some things on our side nearly a century later.
We are certainly much better placed to deal with it now because of the kinds of health systems that we have. Are much stronger in many parts of the world than at that time. On the economic front, I think it's really makes a big difference that there are lenders of last resort. that monetary policy is proactively able to come in, ensure sufficient liquidity in markets,